Morning everybody. This is then the second video of repetition. I'm going to discuss mainly the do while loop statement. My bird Zim decided to join us today. He's mainly falling asleep, so I hope you guys can stay awake at least. Okay, if we go have a look at repetition then. Today I will be discussing the do while loop statement. I will also discuss totals and averages and counting iterations. Thereafter I will have a look at common loop errors and different loop statements and the results thereof in VB. If we then just first of all have a look at the for loop statement, then these three things that happens automatically. And over here I've got a bit of VB code. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to explain logic to you if we have a look at the VB code. When we specify that the counter must start at 1, then VB will automatically initialize the counter once before all the loop statements are executed to our starting value, so to 1. If we specify to 5, then VB will automatically test the counter before each loop iteration. So it's going to test something like counter less or equal to 5. And after each loop iteration, the for loop statement will automatically increment the counter. The do while statement is a little bit more manual. So here we need to, the programmer must initialize, test, and then increment or decrement if you need to, the loop statement. But we can use the do while statement for all types of loops, not just counter controlled loops. The for loop statement has got a little bit of a disadvantage. When I start with this loop statement, I need to know exactly how many times I will do the loop, because I need to specify that for the for loop statement. The while loop syntax then looks like this image. I can actually use either while or until, but for the first use we will only use the while statement. There's not a lot of difference between while and until, it's just the condition that's different. Okay, so for the purpose of our examples, only do while would be used. Remember that we need to initialize, test, and increment the loop statement. A do while and a for loop statement then that's got to display 1 to 5 in a list box will look like this. The two are exactly the same. They will accomplish the same task. Take note that I need to initialize, I need to test, and I need to increment when I use a for loop statement. This is done at a do while statement. This is done automatically if we use a for loop statement. We can have a look at the execution of the for loop. It's just a little bit easier, or the do while loop. It's just a little bit easier if we have a look at the code itself. So for displaying a few numbers for us, I wrote some code, and I'm just going to specify over here that the debugger must start. If I run the code now, the following happens. Screen is displayed. Let me just move it over to us. By accident change the size. Whenever the user click on the button, my code starts executing, and where the debugger specified, it would stop. I can now specify do one step at a time. Click, do one step, counter starts at 1. So I can specify I'd like to keep track of the counter. I will just say add a watch. So we can specify here at the bottom, counter is 1. Now test, is the counter less or equal to max? It is. And those statements gets executed. Counter will be incremented to 2. Loop will start again. Test again. Counter is incremented to 3. Loop statements are executed again. And now it tests, is the counter less or equal to 3 still? Max is storing 3. It is not. So my statements after the loop would execute. There's currently none. So just end sub will execute. And thus the user will see the output. I can have any increment that I want to, or decrement for the while statement. So here the example that would display in increments of 0 to 5 all the values in a list box. If we go to the next example, we can also count down, same as with the for loop, using a do while statement. Careful, I can easily create some errors. If I do not increment in the loop body, I would have an unending loop. In this example, counter will stay 1 forever. We actually need to stop this program using the debugger if this should happen. I also have, in this example, a loop that never executes. Counter is 1 and I'm testing is counter bigger than 10. So my condition is wrong and this loop will never execute. Additionally, a loop that executes the wrong number of times would also cause me an error. In this example, I'd like to display 1 to 4 on the list box, but I forgot the initialization. Counter will start automatically at 0. That is what it would get a value of at declaration. And now 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 will be displayed, which would be wrong. It's not what we needed. Okay, here we've got some example where we need to accept 5 numbers from the user and display those numbers in a list box. I can use a for loop or a while loop statement. I start at 1, I go up until 5. Very often we use a constant value rather than a literal value for the maximum. Just makes the coding a little bit easier if I need to change. And then I count. This counter over here is literally just used to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not using it for any other purpose. I only need to, in this question, display even numbers in the list box. So now I get a number, I test if it's even, only then does it go to the list box, and we're still displaying or continuing with the counter. Over here though, an example where we must, big must, use a do while loop. So if you have a look at the question, it says get 3 positive numbers from the user. I've changed the specifications a little bit. Ignore all negative values. So if the user enters a negative value, ignore it. Only valid numbers must be displayed in the list box. In this case, a for loop statement would be wrong, because a for loop statement can only get 3 numbers. But what if my user actually gave me, let's say 55, 22, and then a finger slip, minus 11 instead of 11. I need 3 positive numbers, so that means 78 must also be entered. This 11 would be ignored by my program because it's not within the valid range. But my program will need to get 4 numbers. A for loop can't do this. A for loop would only get the right data. I would specify 3 numbers at the start, not 4 or 8 or 10. So for this instance, I must use a do-while loop. If we have a look at the programming steps, then I would clear the list box, initialize the counter to 1, test, and now I want to specify there must be a do-while loop statement. So specify I've got a do loop statement and the end value of the counter, get a number, and now I will test that the number is positive. And only if the number is positive will I display that number in the list box and increment the counter. Okay, so only if the number is positive will I do whatever I need to with a number. If my test showed me I've got a negative number, I would simply display an error message to the user and end the program. So the VB code is shown on the right hand side. You can go have a look at that. Okay, but the VB is literally just a translation of the English statements. Totals are then another thing that we very often need to accumulate. Whenever I need a total in a loop, I need to do 3 things. Initialize the total to 0 before the loop. In the loop I will accumulate the total, and after the loop I will display or use that total in whatever way I need to. Totals are by no need connected to a specific loop statement. So we can use any of the 2 loop statements that we need to, depending on our situation. So on the left hand side I show you the 3 important logical steps. Initialize the total to 0. In the loop, after I've got the input, I add the number to total, and after the loop statement I display the total. On the right hand side we've got a bit of VB code where exactly the statements on the left hand side, the steps, are translated to VB. Counters are another thing that we very often need to use with loops. So I might need to count how many even numbers among all the numbers that the user entered there were. And again, if I use a counter, I need to initialize it to 0 before the loop. I will increment it in the loop and display it after the loop. And over here I've got a bit of VB code. I need to get 10 numbers and I need to calculate the number of even values that I've got. So before the loop I will increment my counter or initialize my counter to 0. In the loop we have got the specific number. I can increment my counter, the one that I use to count the even numbers, and then after the loop statement I will display that. So this piece of code actually uses 2 counters. One counter for the for loop to count from 1 to 10, and another counter to count my even numbers. It starts at 0, and whenever I get an even number it increments the value. Over here, an example where we do both an accumulation of the total and we count how many even numbers. Take note, the total in this situation needs to be calculated for all numbers. If we had to accumulate just the even numbers, we would move that total accumulation line to within the if statement. After the if, we display the even numbers and the total. The last thing that you need to know is average calculation. So very often we need to say, give the average of the numbers entered. The formula that we're going to use would be average is equal to total divided by number of, and normally my average would be declared as a double or a decimal depending on the situation. So if I need an average of prices or amounts, I will use decimal for the average. If I need the average of temperatures or lengths or marks or something like that, I will use double for the average. There's two things I need to do. I need to accumulate the total first, and I would need to count how many of the things that I've got. Over here, a little bit of VB code again. We need to calculate the average of 10 numbers that's entered. Take note, I will always calculate the average after the loop. So my formula will be entered after the loop. And here is a terrific use of a constant. I want 10 numbers, so I define a constant. My loop will go up to maximum, and when I need to divide, I use that same constant again. Whenever we need to change the program now and get 15 numbers, the only thing that's got to change would be the value stored in the constant. Careful for loop errors. Okay? We very often can get an infinite loop with a do-while loop if we forget the increment statement. I've got two lines of code over here. Over on the left hand side, I simply add the value to a label. We will very often use list boxes just because it's easier. But I've got a few examples where I want to display output. I've got limited space on the screen, so I'm using labels for that. So an infinite loop or an endless loop is real bad. We need to stop the program by using the debugger. Always remember to increment in the loop. This is another loop error. Assume this loop must display 1 to 10. This loop actually displays 1 to 9. Why? This condition only tests for the counter to be less than 10. So the condition has got an error. It's got to be less than or equal to. Let's now see how good is your knowledge. You can pause the video, look at the code, because I would like to know what would be displayed in the list box. And the answer is nothing at all. Why? Have a look at that test on line 26. Do while counter bigger than 2, or bigger than 10. The counter is 2 currently. So is 2 bigger than 10? No, it isn't. That means the do while loop will never execute. Again, have a look at this code, pause the video. So this code will display 2, 4, 6, 8. Increments of 2, and we stop when the counter is less than 10. What would this code display? I'll display the output in a label, so the numbers would be displayed horizontally. It will display 1, 2, 4 up until 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. What would this code display? And now you need to think a little bit. So it displays 10, 20, 30, 40. The loop executes 4 times. I can see that because the counter starts at 1 and it goes less than 5. Means 4 times. It's incremented in 1. I start with value at 10. I will display it and a space and then add 10 to value. So that would make it 20. So next time the loop executes, 20 and a space is displayed. And then 30 and a space and 40 and a space. So again, what would be executed with this statement and the answer is given to us? The end statement is added. This code will display from 10 down to 1 all the numbers. What would this code display? Pause a moment. And it's actually going to display nothing at all. Why? The counter stores 10. Is 10 bigger than 0? Yes, it is. So that means that would be displayed. I will increment the counter by 1, test again, but counter will never be a value less than 0. It will always remain bigger than. So this will create again an unending loop. My program will hang. I will need to stop it using the debugger. Over here we've got another example of an unending loop. As you can see, no incrementation of the counter in the loop body. A for loop, and what would the for loop display in the list box? Take note, there's only one list box output statement after the loop. So pause a moment, have a look at the code. And it displays 20. It only displays the total. There's actually quite a few different loop statements. It's sufficient for us to explain do while and the for loop statements. You've got the knowledge now to go and try out, have a look at the other statements, to go look at some videos. We will only test you on do while and for next. In industry one day, you might need to use quite a few of the other loop statements because we need to maintain programs that other people coded. So take some time during the recess, go have a look at the other statements as well. So in summary, we saw how the do while loop statement works. We had a look at for next previously. 90% of the time you will use the for statement. It's just easier, does the job for us. There are some situations where we need to use the do while loop. I showed you one where we don't want all the input of the user. If the user input is invalid, we'd like to ignore it. So in this situation we must use a do while, and obviously if a question specifies you must use do while, then that's what you need to code. But for the rest, the option is open to you. You can do what you want to. We had a look at counters, totals, and calculating the average. And again, there's every time a few steps that we need to remember. You'd always find useful links in the 2 links given below. Thank you very much. Bye.